The aerial warfare of the Pacific theater during World War II witnessed a dramatic transformation between 1942 and 1945, characterized by the transition from tactical parity to overwhelming American air superiority. Central to this transformation was the introduction of the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, a carrier-based fighter that would become the most successful naval fighter aircraft in history. While the earlier F-4F Wildcat had held the line during the desperate early years of the Pacific War, the Hellcat represented a quantum leap in capability that fundamentally changed the calculus of aerial combat for Japanese pilots. The F-6F achieved unparalleled combat success, ending the war with a final kill ratio of 19-1, while 307 Navy Hellcat pilots became aces with 5 or more victories. This extraordinary performance stands in stark contrast to the Wildcat's combat record, which, though commendable under the circumstances, reflected the technological and tactical challenges of the early war period. The Wildcat achieved a claimed air combat kill-to-loss ratio of 5.9 to 1 in 1942 and 6.9 to 1 for the entire war. The question of why Japanese pilots feared the Hellcat more than the Wildcat is not merely one of comparative aircraft performance. It encompasses a complex interplay of technological advancement, tactical evolution, training disparities, and the broader strategic context of the Pacific War. This paper will examine these factors systematically to provide a comprehensive understanding of this pivotal development in naval aviation history. 2. Historical context and development. 2.1 The strategic situation, 1941 to 1943. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed what many consider the world's premier carrier-based fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M0. During the early war period, Japanese and American pilots alike viewed the Zero as arguably the most versatile naval fighter in the world, and perhaps the best fighter aircraft until 1942. The Zero's combination of exceptional maneuverability, long range, and experienced pilots gave Japan air superiority throughout the early months of the Pacific War. Against this formidable opponent, the United States Navy fielded the F-4F Wildcat, a sturdy but outclassed fighter. With a top speed of 318 miles per hour, the Wildcat was outperformed by the faster 331 miles per hour, more maneuverable, and longer-ranged Mitsubishi A6M0. Navy pilots quickly recognized the performance deficit they faced, leading to the development of innovative tactics to compensate for their aircraft's limitations. 2.2 The development of the Hellcat. The genesis of the Hellcat predated America's entry into the war. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat began life as a concept for an improved F-4F Wildcat fighter, with studies beginning in early 1938, even before the Wildcat entered production. However, the aircraft that would eventually emerge was far more than an incremental improvement. A critical turning point in the Hellcat's development occurred in April 1942. On April 22, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Butch O'Hare toured the Grumman Aircraft Company and spoke with Grumman engineers, analyzing the performance of the F-4F Wildcat against the Mitsubishi A6M0 in aerial combat. This consultation, along with intelligence from combat operations, directly influenced the aircraft's final configuration. Based on combat accounts of encounters between the F-4F Wildcat and A6M0, on April 26, 1942, the Bureau of Aeronautics directed Grumman to install the more powerful 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney R-2800 double Wasp radial engine, which was already in use with Chance Vought's Corsair since 1940. This engine, producing 2,000 horsepower, would prove transformational. The first production F-6F-3 performed its initial flight on October 3, 1942, and service deliveries of the type began in early 1943. The speed of development was remarkable. Grumman's F-6F Hellcat went from the experimental stage to operational employment in less than 18 months. This rapid deployment reflected both the urgency of the strategic situation and the effectiveness of incorporating combat lessons directly into the design process. 3. Technical and performance comparison. 3.1 Power plant and speed. The most fundamental difference between the Wildcat and Hellcat lay in their power plants. The Wildcat was powered by a Pratt & Whitney R 1830 twin Wasp engine producing approximately 1,200 horsepower, while the Hellcat employed the vastly more powerful Pratt & Whitney R 2800 double Wasp generating 2,000 horsepower. This near doubling of engine power translated into dramatic performance improvements across multiple dimensions. Late in the war, the Wildcat was obsolescent as a frontline fighter compared to the faster 380 miles per hour F-6F Hellcat. This 62 miles per hour speed advantage over the Wildcat and approximately 49 miles per hour advantage over the Zero fundamentally altered the tactical possibilities available to American pilots. Speed, more than any other single factor, determined who could choose when to engage and when to disengage from combat. For Japanese pilots accustomed to the relatively even match between the Zero and Wildcat, the Hellcat's speed came as a shock. The tactical doctrine that had served Japanese pilots well against the Wildcat, using superior maneuverability to force turning engagements, became largely ineffective against an opponent who could simply refuse such engagements and dictate the terms of combat. 3.2 Climb rate and altitude performance. The Hellcat's powerful engine also provided superior climb rate and altitude performance. While precise comparative figures varied based on aircraft configuration and conditions, the Hellcat could reach combat altitude significantly faster than the Wildcat. This advantage proved crucial in carrier operations, where rapid response to incoming threats was essential, and in combat situations where altitude provided both tactical flexibility and survival advantage. The improved climb rate meant that Hellcat pilots could more readily achieve the energy advantage necessary for boom and zoom tactics. Unlike the Wildcat, which often struggled to regain altitude after a diving attack, the Hellcat could climb away from danger and reset for another attack pass with relative ease. 3.3 Armor protection and survivability. Both the Wildcat and Hellcat incorporated armor protection and self-sealing fuel tanks, features that gave them a significant survivability advantage over the lightly built Zero. However, the Hellcat took these protective features to a higher level. The Hellcat's armor included a bulletproof windscreen and 231.2 pounds of cockpit armor, as well as armor around the oil cooler and oil tank under the engine. This enhanced protection meant that Hellcat pilots could absorb significantly more battle damage and return home. The Hellcat was a rugged aircraft that the Japanese found very hard to shoot down, with Hellcat pilots reporting that most Japanese aircraft they shot down either exploded or caught fire, while the Hellcat could take a great deal of damage and still stay in the air. For Japanese pilots, this durability meant that even scoring hits on a Hellcat did not guarantee its destruction. The psychological impact of repeatedly hitting an enemy aircraft only to watch it continue fighting cannot be overstated. This robustness extended combat endurance and increased the probability that American pilots would survive to fight again, accumulating experience and contributing to the growing skill disparity. 3.4 Fuel capacity and range. The Hellcat possessed substantially greater fuel capacity than its predecessor. The Hellcat was fitted with 3 self-sealing fuel tanks with a capacity of 60 U.S. gallons under the pilot's seat, and 1 in each wing with a capacity of 87.5 U.S. gallons, for a total of 235 gallons, over twice the capacity of the Wildcat. This extended range had multiple tactical implications. First, increased fuel capacity extended combat air patrol durations, allowing Hellcats to remain on station longer to protect carrier task forces. Second, it provided greater tactical flexibility during combat, as pilots need not be as concerned about fuel conservation during extended engagements. Third, it enabled the Hellcat to escort strike packages deeper into enemy-controlled territory, providing protection that the shorter-ranged Wildcat often could not sustain. 3.5 Armament. Both aircraft carried the standard American armament of .50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine guns, with the F4F4 Wildcat and the F6F3 Hellcat each mounting 6 of these weapons. However, the Hellcat's more stable gun platform and superior handling characteristics made these weapons more effective. The aircraft's size and power allowed for more ammunition capacity, extending the time pilots could remain in combat before exhausting their ammunition. Some Hellcat variants, particularly the F6F5 Night Fighter version, carried alternative armament configurations, including 20mm cannons, providing even greater striking power against enemy aircraft and ground targets. This flexibility in armament options gave tactical commanders additional capabilities that the Wildcat could not match. 3.6 Handling and carrier operations. While pure performance metrics favored the Hellcat dramatically, its handling characteristics also represented a significant improvement. The Hellcat had wide-set, hydraulically actuated landing gear struts that rotated through 90 degrees while retracting backwards into the wings, compared to the Wildcat's narrow-track, hand-crank gear. This wider landing gear track improved stability during carrier landings, a critical consideration for naval aviation. The U.S. Navy greatly preferred the more docile flight characteristics of the F6F over the Vought F4U Corsair, despite the Corsair's superior speed. The Hellcat's forgiving handling characteristics meant that pilots of varying skill levels could operate it effectively, while its ruggedness tolerated the occasional heavy landing inevitable in carrier operations. This operational reliability ensured that more Hellcats were available for combat missions and that pilot losses due to operational accidents were minimized. 4. Combat performance and statistics. 4.1 The Hellcat's combat record. The statistical record of the Hellcat's combat performance is extraordinary by any measure. During the Pacific War, the Hellcat ran up a 19-to-1 kill ratio, destroying 5,000 enemy aircraft. More specifically, by the end of the war, the Hellcat was credited with shooting down 5,156 enemy aircraft, representing 75% of the entire total for the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. This dominance extended across different types of Japanese aircraft and combat situations. The aircraft performed well against the best Japanese opponents with a 13-to-1 kill ratio against Mitsubishi A6M, 9.5-to-1 against Nakajima Ki, 84, and 3.7-to-1 against Mitsubishi J2M during the last year of the war. Even against improved Japanese fighters introduced late in the war, the Hellcat maintained substantial superiority. The production numbers matched the combat effectiveness. Grumman built 12,275 Hellcats in just 2.5 years, including a record-breaking rate of 1 per hour during its production peak. This manufacturing capacity ensured that the tactical advantage represented by the Hellcat could be deployed throughout the Pacific theater in overwhelming numbers. For point 2, the Wildcat's combat record. While the Hellcat statistics are more impressive, the Wildcat's combat record deserves recognition for what it accomplished under far more difficult circumstances. During the course of the war, Navy and Marine F4FS and FMs flew 15,553 combat sorties, destroying a claimed figure of 1,327 enemy aircraft at a cost of 178 aerial losses, 24 to ground/shipboard fire, and 49 to operational causes, achieving an overall claimed kill-to-loss ratio of 6.9 to 1. The progression of the Wildcat's effectiveness over time illustrates the importance of tactical development. In the Wildcat's first clashes with the Zero after Pearl Harbor during carrier raids in early 1942 and the Battle of the Coral Sea, the kill ratio between the Zero and Wildcat was estimated at 1.5 to 1. However, by the end of the Guadalcanal campaign in February 1943, the Wildcat was shooting down 5.9 Zeros for every Wildcat that was lost. This improvement reflected the development and implementation of new tactics, improved pilot training, and better understanding of both American and Japanese aircraft capabilities. Yet, even at its peak effectiveness, the Wildcat's performance remained substantially below what the Hellcat would achieve. 4.3 First Combat Encounters. The Hellcat's combat debut immediately signaled its superiority. On November 23, 1943, F-6F Hellcat fighters engaged Japanese Zero fighters over Tarawa in the Gilbert Islands and scored 30 kills at the loss of only one. This 30-to-1 ratio in a single engagement far exceeded anything the Wildcat had achieved. Ensign Robert Duncan was deployed on the USS Yorktown in Fighting Squadron 5 in the fall of 1943, and this rookie naval aviator was the first to secure a victory against the vaunted A6M0 in a F-6F Hellcat. The encounter illustrated the Hellcat's advantages in dramatic fashion. Duncan's second chance at aerial combat involved an A6M0 flown by Japanese Ace Warrant Officer Toshiyuki Sueda, with 9 victories, who was very good at luring F-4F Wildcats into a climbing loop, and when the Wildcat stalled and fell away, Sueda would wing over and destroy the Wildcat. However, Sueda, assuming his opponent was a Wildcat, went into his climbing loop, and Duncan, with his spanking new F-6F Hellcat with a 2,000 HP P&W R-2800 engine, followed Sueda into his climb and blew him out of the sky. This engagement encapsulates the transformation the Hellcat represented. Tactics that had proven successful against the Wildcat became death traps when attempted against the more powerful Hellcat. Japanese pilots who mistook Hellcats for Wildcats often paid for the error with their lives. 5. Tactical Evolution and Combat Doctrine. 5.1 The Wildcat Era. Compensating for inferiority. The tactical environment during the Wildcat era required American pilots to fight a defensive war, compensating for their aircraft's performance deficiencies through superior tactics and teamwork. The most significant tactical innovation of this period was the Thatch Weave. The Thatch Weave is an aerial combat tactic in which 2 or more allied planes wove in regularly intersecting flight paths to lure an enemy into focusing on one plane, while the targeted pilot's wingman would come into position to attack the pursuer. Thatch had heard, from a report published in the September 22, 1941 Fleet Air Tactical Unit Intelligence Bulletin, of the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero's extraordinary maneuverability and rate of climb, and before even experiencing it for himself, he began to devise tactics meant to give the slower-turning American Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters a chance in combat. The Thatch Weave's effectiveness stemmed from exploiting the Wildcat's strengths, ruggedness, firepower, and diving ability, while minimizing exposure to the Zero's advantages in turning and climbing. Thatch carried out the first test of the tactic in combat during the Battle of Midway in June 1942, when a squadron of Zeros attacked his flight of 4 Wildcats. The development and implementation of the Thatch Weave represented an admission that American fighters could not compete with Japanese aircraft on equal terms. Wildcat pilots had to rely on mutual support and disciplined tactics to survive, let alone prevail. While these tactics improved the Wildcat's combat effectiveness significantly, they imposed constraints on tactical flexibility and required high levels of discipline and coordination. 5.2 The Hellcat Era. Tactical Dominance. The introduction of the Hellcat fundamentally altered American tactical doctrine in the Pacific. No longer constrained by inferior performance, Hellcat pilots could adopt more aggressive tactics that played to their aircraft's strengths. The boom and zoom approach, diving on enemy aircraft from altitude, making a quick firing pass, and then climbing away, became the standard American tactic. This tactical evolution was facilitated by several factors. First, the Hellcat's superior speed and climb rate meant that pilots could reliably execute these maneuvers without fear of being caught by pursuing Japanese fighters. Second, the aircraft's greater fuel capacity allowed for extended combat operations without constant concern about fuel state. Third, improved training ensured that pilots could exploit these advantages effectively. In a February 1944 attack on the Japanese stronghold of Truk, Lieutenant Eugene A. Valencia escaped attacking Zeros, then turned for a head-on run against them that brought down 3 fighters, with good gunnery counting, but the Hellcat's armor and speed made such feats possible even for new pilots. The Hellcat's capabilities allowed American pilots to control the engagement parameters. They could choose when to fight and when to disengage, attacking only when conditions favored them, and refusing combat when circumstances were disadvantageous. This tactical flexibility represented a complete reversal from the Wildcat era, when Japanese pilots often dictated the terms of engagement. 5.3 The Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Hellcat's dominance reached its zenith during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, an engagement that became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. On June 19, 1944, 480 F-6F Hellcats on 15 American carriers shot down over 400 Japanese aircraft. During the day, the Japanese carrier force lost 240 aircraft out of 370 that had taken part in the operation, and another 30 had suffered non-combat damage. This lopsided engagement resulted from the combination of multiple factors. The Hellcat's technical superiority, improved American pilot training, declining Japanese pilot quality, and effective use of radar and fighter direction. The battle demonstrated that Japanese naval aviation had lost the ability to challenge American carrier forces effectively. Never again would the Japanese Navy be able to attack the Americans with any hope of success. The stark contrast with earlier carrier battles is instructive. During the battles of Coral Sea and Midway in 1942, carrier engagements were desperate affairs where American forces often suffered heavy losses, even in victory. By mid-1944, American carrier task forces could operate with near impunity, confident that their Hellcat-equipped combat air patrols would annihilate any Japanese airstrike. 6. Pilot training and experience factors. 6.1 American training advantages. The disparity in combat effectiveness between the Wildcat and Hellcat eras cannot be attributed to aircraft performance alone. A critical factor was the dramatic improvement in American pilot training quality and the accumulation of combat experience within the pilot corps. To keep up demands for pilots, the U.S. Navy was training 10,000 pilots a year. This massive training program ensured a steady supply of replacement pilots. But more importantly, it allowed for experienced combat pilots to rotate back to training commands to pass on their knowledge. Beginning in the 1930s, the U.S. Navy taught deflection gunnery, which enabled pilots to instinctively know where to aim and fly. And after the Battle of the Coral Sea, experienced pilots would be rotated into training units and use their combat knowledge and skill to train new pilots in a replacement air group. This system meant that by the time the Hellcat entered service, American pilots benefited from both superior aircraft and superior training, incorporating hard-won combat lessons. The training pipeline also emphasized standardization and the dissemination of effective tactics. Innovations like the thatch weave quickly spread throughout the fighter community, ensuring that all pilots had access to proven combat methods. This institutional learning process accelerated dramatically after 1942, creating a positive feedback loop where combat experience improved training, which produced more effective pilots who generated additional insights to further refine training. 6.2 The decline of Japanese pilot quality. In stark contrast to American improvements, Japanese pilot quality declined precipitously after 1942. The average U.S. naval aviator now had greater training and combat experience than his Japanese counterpart, with Navy pilots encountering increasingly inferior enemy pilots and aircraft. The fundamental problem was attrition. Japan's pre-war pilot training system produced exceptionally skilled aviators, but it was designed for a small, elite force. When these experienced pilots were lost in combat, Japan lacked the infrastructure to replace them with equivalently trained personnel. While Japanese pilots were more experienced at the beginning of the war with the U.S., over time the attrition rate reduced skill levels, as pilots flew until they were killed, seriously injured, or unable to fly due to illness or disease. Lack of resources and an inflexible training methodology and philosophy reduced the quality of new pilots or acquisition of improved tactics, while limited production of new aircraft further impacted the ability of the Imperial Japanese Navy response. By 1944, newly trained Japanese pilots often had minimal flight hours before being thrust into combat against experienced American aviators flying superior aircraft, a combination that proved uniformly fatal. The loss of experienced pilots also meant the loss of institutional knowledge. Without a rotation system similar to the American approach, Japanese tactical innovations and combat lessons died with the pilots who possessed them. New pilots entered combat without the benefit of experienced mentorship, forced to learn through trial and error in an environment where errors were fatal. 7. Strategic and operational context. 7.1 Radar and fighter direction. The technological advantage extended beyond the aircraft themselves. American carrier task forces incorporated sophisticated radar systems and fighter direction capabilities that multiplied the effectiveness of their aircraft. The Battle of Midway and the Solomon campaigns saw the use of the Combat Information Center develop as a significant operational tool, and other engagements saw U.S. use of Australian coast watchers in the Solomon Islands, enabling Wildcat and P-39 units to launch with enough advance notice to have an altitude advantage when Japanese formations arrived. This early warning and direction capability meant that American fighters could be positioned advantageously before Japanese strikes arrived. Hellcats could be vectored to intercept incoming raids at altitude, negating much of the tactical surprise that Japanese forces had enjoyed earlier in the war. The integration of radar, fighter direction, and improved aircraft created a defensive system that Japanese aviation could not penetrate effectively. 7.2 Industrial capacity. The disparity in industrial capacity between the United States and Japan profoundly influenced the air war's trajectory. Grumman built 12,275 Hellcats in just 2.5 years, including a record-breaking rate of 1 per hour during its production peak. This production capacity ensured that losses could be replaced rapidly and that the numerical superiority enjoyed by American forces grew continuously. In contrast, Japan struggled to maintain aircraft production levels. Japan could never keep up with training replacement pilots and could never hope to win against the industrial might of the United States. Even when Japan developed improved fighter designs to counter the Hellcat, such as the Nakajima Ki-84 or Kawanishi N-1K, these aircraft never appeared in sufficient numbers to challenge American air superiority. The industrial advantage also manifested in logistics and support. American carriers operated with well-stocked parts inventories, skilled maintenance personnel, and efficient repair facilities. Aircraft that suffered damage could often be repaired and returned to service quickly. Japanese forces, conversely, struggled with spare parts shortages, overtaxed maintenance crews, and inadequate repair facilities, reducing the effective strength of their air groups beyond combat losses. 7.3 The Kamikaze Response. The introduction of kamikaze tactics in late 1944 represented, in many ways, an admission of defeat in conventional air combat. The losses inflicted by the Hellcat soon forced the Japanese into an act of desperation, the kamikaze. Unable to engage American fighters effectively in traditional air-to-air combat, Japan resorted to suicide attacks against American shipping. While kamikaze attacks posed a serious threat to American naval forces, they represented the complete abandonment of any hope of achieving air superiority. The decision to employ suicide tactics implicitly acknowledged that Japanese pilots could not expect to survive combat with American fighters and might as well ensure their deaths accomplished some military purpose. This grim calculus reflected the hopelessness of Japan's situation by late 1944. 8. Comparative analysis. Why the Hellcat inspired greater fear. 8.1 Performance advantages. The direct performance comparison between the Wildcat and Hellcat explains much of the difference in Japanese pilot perception. The Wildcat, while inferior to the Zero in speed and maneuverability, was not so drastically outclassed that Japanese pilots felt helpless against it. Skilled Japanese pilots could exploit the Zero's advantages to gain tactical superiority, and many did so successfully throughout 1942 and early 1943. The Hellcat eliminated this tactical advantage. Its superior speed meant Japanese pilots could no longer count on catching American fighters in disadvantageous positions. Its climb rate prevented the altitude advantages that Japanese pilots had previously enjoyed. Its armor and durability meant that scoring hits no longer guaranteed victories. From a Japanese pilot's perspective, the Hellcat represented an opponent that could not be reliably defeated using established tactics and techniques. 8.2 Psychological impact. The psychological impact of the Hellcat's introduction cannot be overstated. Japanese pilots who had grown accustomed to air superiority suddenly found themselves outmatched. The experience of repeatedly engaging enemy aircraft and suffering losses fundamentally altered pilot morale and combat effectiveness. With its speed, armament, and armored protection, the Grumman F-6F Hellcat was a rude awakening for the Imperial Japanese pilots. This rude awakening manifested in multiple ways. First, it shattered the myth of Zero invincibility that had sustained Japanese pilots through the early war period. Second, it forced Japanese aviation to adopt defensive tactics and procedures for which they were ill-prepared and ill-suited. Third, it created a psychological atmosphere of inevitable defeat that corroded unit cohesion and individual determination. The misidentification incidents, where Japanese pilots mistook Hellcats for Wildcats and applied tactics that proved fatal, further contributed to the Hellcat's fearsome reputation. Each such incident reinforced the lesson that the rules of engagement had fundamentally changed and that techniques that had previously worked were now death sentences. 8.3 Cumulative effect. The Hellcat's impact must be understood as cumulative rather than instantaneous. While individual engagements might result from specific tactical or situational factors, the aggregate effect of hundreds of sorties and thousands of combat encounters created an overwhelming pattern. Japanese pilots learned, often through bitter experience, that engaging Hellcats was likely to prove fatal regardless of circumstances. This cumulative effect created a self-reinforcing dynamic. As Japanese losses mounted, experienced pilots who might have developed effective countertactics were killed, while replacement pilots lacked the skill or training to compete effectively. The quality disparity grew wider with each engagement, making subsequent encounters even more one-sided. By 1945, the mere presence of Hellcats often deterred Japanese pilots from pressing attacks, as the expected casualties outweighed any potential tactical gains. 9. The Wildcat's legacy and limitations. 9.1 Holding the line. The Wildcat's historical significance lies not in achieving air superiority, but in preventing Japanese air supremacy during the critical 1942 to 1943 period. Wildcat pilots made major contributions to the American victories at Coral Sea, Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Solomons, as well as in the Battle of the Atlantic. These battles occurred when America's material and training advantages had not yet manifested, and outcomes remained genuinely uncertain. During this period, Wildcat pilots held the line through courage, skill, and innovative tactics rather than aircraft superiority. They developed the thatch weave and other defensive measures, learned to exploit the Wildcat's advantages while minimizing its weaknesses, and accumulated the combat experience that would inform future aircraft development and pilot training. 9.2 Tactical Constraints. The Wildcat imposed significant tactical constraints that limited American operational flexibility. Its limited speed and climb rate meant that intercepts had to be carefully timed and positioned. Its fuel capacity restricted combat patrol durations and operational radius. Its performance ceiling limited the altitudes at which it could operate effectively. These constraints forced American commanders to adopt conservative operational approaches. Carrier task forces had to position themselves more carefully, accepting greater risks to bring their fighters within range of enemy forces. Escort duties for strike packages were complicated by the Wildcat's inability to keep pace with faster aircraft or protect them at higher altitudes. Combat air patrols had to be cycled more frequently due to fuel limitations, reducing the number of aircraft available at any given time. 9.3 The Experience Foundation. Despite these limitations, the Wildcat era provided the foundation for future success. The tactical lessons learned during this period directly influenced Hellcat employment. The emphasis on teamwork, disciplined tactics, and aggressive gunnery became ingrained in naval aviation culture. Perhaps most importantly, the survivors of the Wildcat era formed the cadre of experienced pilots and instructors who would train the next generation of aviators. Lessons learned from the Wildcat were later applied to the faster F-6F Hellcat, with the Hellcat able to rely on superior power and high-speed performance to outperform the Zero. This knowledge transfer ensured that the Hellcat entered service with a mature tactical doctrine and a pilot corps prepared to exploit its capabilities effectively. 10. Conclusion. The question of why Japanese pilots feared the Hellcat more than the Wildcat admits of no simple answer. The explanation encompasses technological, tactical, training, and strategic factors that combine to create an overwhelming Allied advantage by 1944. From a purely technical perspective, the Hellcat represented a generational leap in capability. Its 2,000 horsepower engine, 380 miles per hour top speed, enhanced armor protection, and doubled fuel capacity gave it decisive advantages in virtually every performance category. These specifications translated into tactical flexibility that allowed American pilots to engage on favorable terms and disengage when circumstances dictated. The statistical record provides quantitative confirmation of this superiority. The Hellcat's 19-to-1 kill ratio nearly tripled the Wildcat's respectable but more modest 6.9-to-1 ratio. The Hellcat shot down 5,156 enemy aircraft, representing 75% of all U.S. Navy and Marine Corps air-to-air victories during the war. These numbers reflect not just better aircraft, but the complete integration of superior technology, tactics, training, and strategy. The human factors proved equally significant. While the Wildcat era saw American pilots fighting at a disadvantage, relying on courage and innovation to compensate for inferior equipment, the Hellcat era witnessed the full flowering of American training systems and the catastrophic decline of Japanese pilot quality. The average U.S. naval aviator had greater training and combat experience than his Japanese counterpart, encountering increasingly inferior enemy pilots and aircraft. The strategic context amplified these advantages. American industrial capacity produced Hellcats in overwhelming numbers, while Japanese production struggled. Radar and fighter direction systems multiplied combat effectiveness. The rotation of experienced pilots back to training commands created a self-reinforcing cycle of improvement that Japan could not match. For Japanese pilots, the transition from facing Wildcats to facing Hellcats marked a fundamental shift in the nature of aerial combat. Against Wildcats,